Monday mornings, we have an opportunity to speak to Randy Staples, the publisher of Idaho Weekly Briefing. We take a few minutes and talk about some of the more pressing stories and issues that we have in the state of Idaho, and that includes politics to weather, a lot of times just to some social issues and the like. All of these things do come up from time to time. It's 8:43, 28. Bill Colley with you as well on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX and News Radio 1310.com. Randy, first of all, welcome back to the program.
Good to be here.
Let's start right away by telling people if they'd like to look at the briefing, where would you send them?
I'd send them to www.ridenbaughpress.com. That's RIDENBAUGH.
I was telling you off air that I got to meet last week Tommy Alquist, who's one of the 1,730 Republicans now announced for governor. I may exaggerate that slightly, but it's getting to be a big field. He's a tall fellow. He's about 6.5 feet tall. Obviously, he's got quite a resume when it comes to business and medicine, which is his other field. You were reflecting in your weekly column about how the field is growing, even though despite the fact that Republicans have had an heir apparent for so long.
Usually, at this point in a campaign election cycle, where we're still more than a year away from the deadline for filing for office, much less even something like a primary election, which is further away than that. Usually, you have nothing more than rumors of candidates who are possibles, who are thinking about running and maybe talking to people about it, maybe getting their name out there a little bit in the event of. But in this case, we've essentially got three fairly major candidates for governor, and there's a fourth that would be as major as any of them. Who spread the word. This would be Raul Labrador, who has pretty clearly spread the word of don't count me out as a contender here, and that's at this stage. And there's no reason to think necessarily that it might not go much further than that. I saw an editorial out of Lewiston that was pointing out the unpredictability of what can happen when you have really large numbers of candidates in a race, and you don't really know for sure what's going to happen. Sometimes people that are considered front runners early on don't wind up winning when the vote is split as deeply as that. The last time that a governor's race was split as seriously as this between major candidates for governor was all the way back in 1978, which was one of the first governor's races that I covered. And the winner of that race was not the person who most people then thought was going to win, who was a Magic Valley guy named Vern Ravenscroft. And it wasn't the person who is the current governor of Idaho, who came in something like fourth or fifth. His name was Butch Otter. It was a legislator, the Speaker of the House, named Alan Larson, who went on to lose to Democrat John Evans in the fall. It's these kind of very deeply split races can be very unpredictable, and the more people that get in, the more unpredictable they can be.
I think our history shows us in the presidential election last year that's very, very true.
Yeah. Well, you're right. You can look at the presidential campaigns and see that as well. Races tend to be easier to predict when you have two people in them, or maybe when there are three. But when you have a race with this many serious candidates in it, there are so many moving parts that they become very hard to predict. And what you really need is a professor of chaos theory to really work it out and really be sure of what the result might be.
Well, I know it's very early, but a lot of the Republicans I talk to in leadership positions, uh, nobody is really yet. I mean, Brad Little always has had, I think, a group that thoroughly backs him because he's been a loyalist and he's been the man in waiting for so long.
Oh
However,
yeah, yeah.
Fulcher did so well a few years ago in a primary that he has, but he'd split that with Labrador, that particular, I think, voting block. And that's where Alquist comes in, who seems to be focusing on the larger communities and the media centers, this could get very, very interesting.
Well, and then there's the factor of Raul Labrador as well, and if what some of his advocates say, and what he has not really been explicit in saying, but what he suggested is that he may very well get in. Then it raises the question of how that would resplit the pie, and then it starts to get really complicated, really complex, and it's very hard to tell. My offhand guess, if it's split, if the pie is split in that way, is that it would tend to favor Little. That his block would probably hold together a little bit more, and the others, the rest of it might fragment a little bit more. But that could be wrong. That could easily be wrong. Little has certainly got a good deal of, I guess you would say, establishment support, and he's very well. There are a lot of people who regard him very highly and have for a long time. And there was a long stretch before he served in the legislature, which he did before becoming lieutenant governor, that he was sort of the great candidate who couldn't quite be brought into the political sphere. Republicans kept trying to bring him in for some years before he actually did agree to run. So now, in running for this major office, we'll see how well all of that goes.
We've got a legislative session coming to a close soon, and I was also mentioning off the air, I was talking to one of our rookie legislators who said that the response she's getting from a lot of people isn't so much about the perceived wing of the party that she belongs to, but as a newcomer, newcomers just don't get a lot of attention when they introduce legislation. Uh, I guess that's probably true.
That's probably true. The newcomers haven't yet established the kind of relatively deep relationships. They don't have the seniority that can help give them additional clout. They don't have as much to bargain with in terms of either being able to influence other legislation or being able to pull other votes along with them. These things take time to develop, and when you get toward the end of the session, and we're heading, I would say somewhere in the area of 2 to 3 weeks probably, uh, toward the end of the session. The leadership in both House and Senate are going to be very oriented toward wrapping things up and shutting things down, and they're not really very interested in wanting to bring in a lot of new major discussions at this point. A lot of what the legislature right now is going to be focused on is probably getting the budget taken care of, getting any financial issues wrapped up. Those are the only things that the legislature is strictly obliged to deal with each session. So once they've got those done, then they will adjourn. And as always happens, other things will be left hanging, and leadership will probably tell the newcomers, and as well a lot of senior members who weren't able to get their particular measures through. Well, try it again next session, and next time try to get it in front of everybody earlier in the session. And that's really is a lobbying key, I think, for anybody who wants to get legislation in. It's usually a good deal easier to get something done with it if you've gotten it started early in the session when things are moving a little more slowly and the priority isn't on getting out.
I didn't see in the last couple of years some of the social issues had been heavily argued, and I was surprised. There was a bit of that last week, but I've been surprised that we haven't seen more of that this year. The focus has been very narrow.
Focus has been, yeah, I think that's right, and maybe part of it was the session got off to kind of an uncertain and a little bit controversial start with some of the Heather Scott comments and a few other things like that, and that may have just kind of oriented the people who were leading the chambers to just kind of want to hunker down a little bit more and get the job done rather than try to head off on some particular crusade or other.
In fact, I was surprised. I've forgotten the bill right off the top of my head, but last week she was actually leading the charge on a bill, and the majority joined her, which I thought it sometimes shows that there may be some disagreements, but they're still all Republicans.
That's true, and all these things vary by subject matter too. The personalities matter, but if you've got, it's also the case that if you have a piece of legislation that people want to sign on to, they'll very often tend to do it. There would in a case like that, there would probably have to be some compelling reason not to.
I just looked up at a TV monitor here in the room, and there was Tommy Alquist at a drawing board. So apparently, he's already spending the money when it comes to political advertising.
Well, that's where most of it goes. Uh, I've long been of the view that political advertising in and of itself is becoming less and less effective because there's so many relatively free or cheap ways to communicate. TV ads have been long thought to be kind of the coin of the realm. I think that's much less true now than it used to be, because now for far less money you can put an ad out on YouTube and it gets just as much currency, gets just as much attention. Probably gets more attention and more credibility with people than most TV ads, because I think a lot of people tend to tune TV ads out.
Yeah, yeah. I don't blame them.
Neither do I.
uh, we've got a couple of minutes to go. I was telling you too off the air as well that I took a drive down Route 30 from Twin Falls to Burley the other day, and I you can read about it, you can see some aerial pictures, you get a pretty good idea that the roads are in bad shape. But gosh, to actually drive them, what a shock it is just to see how serious a problem that is.
Well, when you have flooding and icy and snowy roads, kind of cycling back and forth around each other, it's going to play major havoc with any roadways. And I think there's going to be a lot of southern Idaho where you're going to be seeing transportation people, state transportation department, and others saying that there's going to be a lot of work needed. That these roads are really in bad shape this year. I suspect that's going to be true.
That was I think an unexpected became an unexpected legislative priority as well.
Yes, yes. Well, there's been some discussion about what are the costs of this winter, and there have been some costs discussed, of course, in the whole area of just clearing snow and doing things like that. But there are other costs that will continue to feed on for months to come, and the roads are going to be a major part of that.
Well, there was an effort, and I don't know that it's finalized yet, for $52 million. But we already were in a crisis situation with roads and bridges. This is only going to add to that.
Oh yeah, yeah. This the Idaho was already in kind of a hole on some of this, and this makes it considerably deeper. And this was a legislative session where there was not as much discussion as there usually has been in most of the last decade and more about transportation issues. Transportation funding has been a big thing going back to the early 2000s, and this year not so much. And my hunch is that next session we'll be seeing a lot more talk about it.
I think so too. Randy Staples is our guest this morning, and we're wrapping up in just a moment before 9 o'clock news. Randy, for those folks tuning in today, where would you send them so they could read Idaho Weekly Briefing?
I would send them to www.ridenbaughpress.com, RIDENBAUGH.
I had an old college friend who saw one of the videos from our show the other day and said, "Well, it doesn't look like you work up a sweat in your line of work." But I have to tell people that when I take a look at the briefing every week, you're a really busy guy.
There's a lot of material in it, but then there are a lot of things that happen in Idaho very often that a lot of people don't pay that much attention to, and that don't get major headlines. But there are lots of bits and pieces that happen out there, and that people ought to be aware of.
And just even the snow totals and gasoline prices and the comparisons from around the state. I like to look at those. I find it fascinating every week to see some of those changes.
Well, they provide a little bit of perspective, a little bit of a baseline that you can use. Sometimes the prices go up, sometimes they go down, and sometimes it helps to have some kind of a relatively objective look at what the numbers are.
Well, Randy, we'll talk again next Monday morning. Look forward to that, and hope you have a great week.
You too.
Randy Staples joining us this morning from Idaho Weekly Briefing. It's 8:59, and news from Fox is just around the corner. Also, one more hour of top story ahead with Bill Colley. We're at 29. Maybe a few snow showers today. The weather forecast says they could develop in the afternoon, and maybe a mix of snow and rain at times tomorrow. It will not be as bad as some of what we have seen in the last couple of months, which is a good thing. I just want to mention, of course, check of the weather brought to you by Mountain Home Auto Ranch. We should also point out, too, as well, it's going to get a lot warmer before the end of the week.